Today we are excited to welcome Richard Poe, an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who digs deep into hidden truths about global power. He has written books like The Shadow Party and How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. You can see the cover here. And of course, his forthcoming book, which is very exciting, due out in October, Who Killed Lincoln? The Case Against England, which you can see the cover here. And I must say, Richard has a rare gift for showing how the empire's influence still shapes our world, and we can't wait to hear his insight. So, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Harry. Great to be here.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question. It's very important for me to build the structure for the audience to really understand the scale of your research because it's huge. And I need you to try to explain how the British Empire shifted from overt colonialism to a covert globalist system. What was the core goal of this transformation, and what were the key strategies that made it possible?
Well, basically, what you're talking about is the shift from the what they call the Second British Empire to the Third British Empire, and this is something that the British themselves talked about quite openly in the early part of the 20th century. Around the turn of the 20th century, there was a book by a guy named Alfred Zimmern called The Third British Empire, who explained it. And this was a strategy that the British came up with in the late 19th century as they realized that basically the power of the United States was growing and that American power would soon eclipse British power. They realized that they were vulnerable. That is, that the British were vulnerable because their empire was physically spread out around the world and could be easily attacked by various enemies, various rivals whom they were concerned about, especially Russia and Germany. But by, let's say, the turn of the 20th century, those were the ones they were most concerned about. And so they were already planning in the late 19th century, they were planning the next set of wars that they would have to fight in order to maintain their preeminence. And they were already pondering what alliances they would have to make in order to meet the challenge of these very powerful new empires. Germany, of course, which had just reunified in the 1870s. Russia, of course, wasn't a new empire, but it was newly powerful because it was modernizing, it was industrializing, and it was becoming more advanced and more of a threat to the British. So they were looking at that situation and they concluded that their best bet was to merge with the United States of America. And there was a very high level elite group of British aristocrats and intellectuals, and really some of the top thinkers and most powerful people in Great Britain. And they came together in, I guess, what you could call a sort of secret society called the Round Table. And the very purpose of this group, the Round Table, which of course was named after King Arthur's Round Table, was that the great minds would get together and figure out how to move Great Britain into its next phase of evolution. So, long story short, the plan they came up with was to merge with the United States of America, to transfer to the United States the responsibility and the expense of policing the world, of guarding and policing the empire militarily, which was extremely expensive and was getting very burdensome for England to bear. And so that was one of their biggest goals, was to in a sense appoint the United States of America to police the empire and to pay for the military cost and the human cost of this policing and any wars that would have to be fought to bear the brunt of them. And this was at the core of the Roundtable Plan. And so at the same time that they were planning to merge with the United States in some way, in some form, they also envisioned global government as we know it today. The British plan, which they had been pushing really since 1815, since the defeat of Napoleon and since the establishment of the so-called concert of Europe, the old order of of Europe, how the great powers organized power in Europe. Ever since that system was created, the British were already actually seeking to undermine it and to surpass it and to replace it with a system that was more advantageous to themselves. Because what they didn't like about the old system was that it gave too much power to their rivals, countries like Prussia, or soon to be Germany, Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia. All of these powers had helped defeat Napoleon, and so they had to be given a place at the table. But the British were already planning ahead to getting rid of those powers, which they eventually did, pushing them aside, weakening them, disabling them, and then replacing this old, let's call it a multilateral or multipolar system, with what we might call a unipolar system of English-speaking countries, which in the mind of the Round Table would be led and guided by the British. So they envisioned global government as early as 1815, and there's a tremendous amount of writings and speeches about this by British people, that it was a purely British invention. There is a myth today that it was supposedly an American invention, invented by our president Woodrow Wilson, and I show in my writings that this is a complete myth. The idea of a League of Nations, the idea of global government, generally was totally a British idea, and the only reason it became credited to Wilson is because in 1916 the British Foreign Secretary sent a letter to Wilson's right-hand man, a guy named Colonel House, and said to him, look, we want to start a peace league, a League of Nations after the war, but we want the idea to come from an American president. It will look better. It will be more acceptable to other countries than if it comes from us, the British. And so they asked this Colonel House if he could persuade President Wilson to actually claim that this was his idea and that he was the one pushing it. And Wilson agreed to do this. Now, what is very interesting about that maneuver is that Colonel House, who was President Wilson's right-hand man, his greatest confidant, his most powerful advisor, he was a British agent. He had been recruited by the British quite early on, and he was very close and essentially reported to the British Foreign Secretary and to a man named Wiseman, who was the British station chief for British foreign intelligence in charge of America. And so this guy Wiseman was very close to these top figures in British intelligence and the British Foreign Office, to the extent that he must be called a British agent. I mean, he was coordinating with them all of these schemes to manipulate the president and to feed him policies that were not his policies. And so, and in doing so, he was not serving American interests at all. He was serving British interests. So he was clearly an agent for the British government. And this is often not observed even by writers who are, let's say, more avant-garde, more uh, looking for alternative views of history. You might call them conspiracy theorists, if you want to use that term. But people who explore these alternative views uh, always write about Colonel House for obvious reasons. He was a very strange and sinister figure in American history at that point, but they almost never point to his British connections, even though those connections are so very obvious. Usually they say that he was an agent for the Rothschilds, for the Jews, for Jewish bankers. And yet it's plain as day when you look at the plain facts that the people who were controlling him were the British establishment, the British intelligence, the British Foreign Office. And so this is one of the ways that I noticed after many years of study of these kinds of, let's call them alternative histories of our time, trying to look behind the obvious and look at what's going on behind the scenes. What I discovered is that the alternative histories have been worked on in a way that is deliberate and calculated, and which is designed to take attention off of the British role in all this sort of conspiracy and skullduggery, and to point relentlessly toward Jews, and in particular Jewish bankers, and in particular the Rothschilds. Now, I'm not saying that these men, the Rothschilds or whoever, I'm not saying that they didn't have any role in skullduggery. Of course they did. They were powerful men. They made deals. They were just as involved in all of these schemes as anybody else. But what I am saying is that there has clearly been a deliberate and systematic attempt, not an attempt, but a successful operation that has been carried out to actually change our history, American history, and I would say British history, and probably the history of many other countries in Europe and around the world. But my focus is mainly on English-speaking countries right now, and it's very clear that this narrative has been pushed, that everything bad that has happened, and in particular the spread of globalism with all its obvious evils, that this was the project of Jews and of Jewish bankers in particular. So
Yeah.
this is just one example where you start to see this intrusive narrative coming into the record, where you have this man, Colonel House, who was clearly and obviously a British agent, and clearly answering to British handlers, and clearly pursuing well-known British objectives, but somehow we're not allowed to know that even if you think you're being smart, or you think you're being cute, and you go to the alternative sources and you think, well, they'll tell me the truth, I'm not going to listen to the mainstream sources. I'll go to the alternative people, the dissident people, and I'll read them. But what I discovered is that the dissident media itself has been targeted just as intensely as the mainstream media. It has been worked and processed in such a way, and by the same people, but basically by the intelligence agencies, most particularly of Great Britain. And by this means, the story I just told you about the Round Table and their plan to form a world government and to incorporate the United States of America into a new British Empire, which Alfred Zimmern called the Third British Empire. This whole plan was just wiped out of our history books. It was even wiped to a large degree out of the more conspiratorial alternative histories, and instead the narrative of Jewish conspiracy was substituted for it. Were you going to say something, Harry?
No, I'm waiting for you to finish the point, and then
Okay.
yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Mhm.
I was answering a question. Remind me of what the question was. I
No,
misheard
in
it.
general, I wanted for the audience to understand the British strategy, and I would like actually to focus, if you can, about the clandestine services that they have and how they were able to push all these color revolutions. You mentioned in your writings that you were very proud, recognizing, for example, the color revolution in Portugal. But later on, I think you said that you actually found out that they are responsible, at least indirectly, to the French Revolution. They even supported the Civil War in America, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And I would like for you to explain how they are manipulating and using those revolutions to advance their strategy, please.
Right. Well, it is my point of view. Not everyone agrees with me, but I believe that the British secret services have long been, for centuries, the very best in the world, and I believe they still are today. A lot of people think that's ridiculous. They don't believe it. They see England as a weak and incompetent country, which is incapable of doing the things that I say it does. But the fact is, the British themselves put out this idea that they are weak and incompetent. It's part of their camouflage. And I call it playing possum. That's an expression we have in America, this animal called a possum, which plays dead when it's in danger. And I, I see this again and again with the British. They're continually playing this game of playing possum, of pretending to be weak, pretending to be incompetent, pretending to be stupid. And a really good example of that are the spy novels of John le Carré, the very famous spy novelist who was also an MI6 operative uh, during the Cold War. And he wrote these novels such as Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, where the constant theme of them was to portray British intelligence as being incompetent and peopled by well-meaning bumblers and often not so well-meaning, often traitors, and just people who were completely unable or unwilling to do their job. And I believe this was by design. Now, John le Carré, this author, he may have had his own resentments and his own uh, criticisms, his own private criticisms of his colleagues in the British intelligence community. But I think, in a larger sense, he was allowed to have a big platform, writing these best-selling books and having them made into movies. He was he was allowed to have this platform. He was given this platform because his message was approved. And his message was very, very clearly that one, British intelligence is weak, ineffective, and incompetent. Two, that it's utterly dominated by the Americans. And three, that the whole concept of the Cold War is stupid and hypocritical and ridiculous. Now, this is a very strange message to receive from someone who was supposedly fighting the Cold War at its very peak on the front lines in Berlin, where he was posted at some point. But that's the message he was conveying. And so often, when you study these propaganda narratives that are subtly buried into our popular culture and our popular literature and movies, when you really see what is being broadcast to the people, how the people are being programmed, it's very, very surprising what let's call it the deep state, a term that was coined by John le Carré, actually. Um, the things that the deep state wants us to believe are often not the things we think they want us to believe. Why, at the height of the Cold War, would they be sending us a message that the Cold War is all nonsense and the people who take it seriously are fools and hypocrites? Yet this was the message coming out of the spy novels of John le Carré and through many other conduits in our popular culture. And this is because the British, who I insist are still controlling these channels of cultural communication, these channels of soft power, uh, these channels of psychological manipulation through which people's attitudes are molded and controlled. I insist that the British are still in control of it because they are the ones who set up these conduits in the first place, because they never relinquished their control over them, and because they are the ones with a plan. You know, in human affairs, the man with the plan will always win. And the British formulated this plan, which is now unfolding before us, this plan to merge with the United States to create a global government led by the English speaking countries under British control, under British influence, and masquerading as a global government which is somehow supposedly democratically controlled by all the countries of the earth, by which I mean, of course, the United Nations system, all of the transnational global infrastructure that we have today. All of this was set up by the British. They were the ones with the plan. They were the ones who executed the plan. They were the ones who prodded and manipulated the United States of America over many generations to adopt this plan and to go through with this plan when America really didn't want to, when America was actually fighting very hard to resist it, to the point where in 1919 the U.S. Senate rejected the League of Nations, turned it down and said, no, we want nothing to do with it. And they rejected it specifically on the grounds, if you go and look at the actual arguments that were made before the U.S. Senate, they specifically saw it as a British plan whose purpose was to draw the United States into a permanent military alliance with England, whereby we would be required to fight all their wars for them. I mean, this was clearly stated in the counter arguments to the League of Nations, and it was on the basis of these arguments that the U.S. Senate refused to join. And so
it was an American Irish speaker who was able to demonstrate the manipulation that the British was trying to create with the League of Nations, right?
yes, that's right. And Irish Americans, in fact, have always been at the forefront of those Americans who are very attentive and very critical of British influence and very suspicious of British influence. And excuse me. So, 1 second.
Of course.
So there was a man, you're referring to my book. There was a Judge Cohalan in particular, whom I quoted fairly extensively, his testimony before the U.S. Senate in 1919. And he was an Irish American. I believe he was born here in New York. He was a judge in New York and a very prominent figure. But like so many of the Irish Americans generally, he was intensely loyal to his home country, Ireland, and very much involved in the Irish Republican movement. And so he testified before the Senate very eloquently and knowledgeably, where he basically said that he gave them a little lecture on British power and describing Great Britain or the British Empire as what he called an invisible empire, quote unquote, where he said that the power of England is much greater than it appears. Now, this is in 1919, where Britain was really at the very height of its power and was rapidly moving to the very height of its just the sheer landmass that it controlled on the earth. Ultimately, it controlled about 25% of the Earth's surface directly, that is, through direct colonial government. But even then, at a time when everyone understood that England ruled the waves, and England had just won World War One and basically eliminated every rival power on the European continent. And even at that time, when the image people had of England was as the most powerful country on earth, arguably, um, even then, this man Cohalan was saying, as powerful as you think the British are right now, today, in 1919, they are much more powerful than you think, because their empire, their real empire, is invisible. It goes way beyond the colonial territories that they control, and it goes to many other countries which they influence through their economic dominance and their economic manipulations. And several witnesses actually said very similar things. Again, as you pointed out, Irish Americans, a whole group of them came and essentially testified to the same thing, this concept of an invisible British Empire whose power was a threat to the United States, that it was a threat to our independence, because these Irish Americans warned Britain had never relinquished her ambitions to restore her colonial control over North America to its former glory, and that this League of Nations was a step toward that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's interesting about this testimony by these Irish American Republicans before the US Senate is that we can confirm everything they said from British sources. It wasn't just them saying it, but British sources, very authoritative ones, confirm everything that they said and warned about. And the first is that book I mentioned before, The Third British Empire, by Alfred Zimmern, who was one of these round tablers, one of the members of this round table secret society. And he clearly said in this book that the Second British Empire was the colonial empire, the seagoing empire that we all think of when we think of the British Empire. But the Third British Empire, he said, would be a new system of global government that would rule the entire world in partnership with the United States of America. And he called this system, which already existed at that point. He wrote that book in, I think, 1926. So there was already a League of Nations, and he named it. He named the League of Nations as an institution of the Third British Empire. So at that point in the 1920s, they were still admitting that this was a British project and that its purpose was to preserve and to expand British Empire into a new era to meet new challenges, and that the key was to join forces with the United States and to establish global government, which in some way would be controlled or led by one of these writers called it a nucleus of power, quote unquote, centered in the English-speaking countries, and in particular in England.
Mm-hmm.
So
Richard, I would like for us to focus because I think it's very important for the audience to understand the methods they're using. So can you please explain what is the color revolution and give a specific example of how they mobilize the color revolution and for what end, uh,
sure,
whatever of your
sure.
choosing.
Well, the color revolution, of course,
Um,
is
Richard, because forgive me for a second, because I think we experienced one in Israel, especially around the judicial question and before the war and during the war, and I think the same happened in the States after the first Trump election. I mean, when Biden was enjoying those stolen election. So I think it's very important to focus on that and to try to demonstrate how the British are benefiting from it. If
sure. Well, a color revolution, of course, is a fake revolution. It's when you have a regime change, a coup, or most usually a so-called people's revolution, an uprising, typically with thousands of people marching through the streets with banners and flags, and often with some kind of a color-coded emblem. That some color will be associated with the revolution. Typically, well, back in 2004, of course, we had the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and there have been other revolutions based on colors and other symbols. We had the Bulldozer Revolution, so-called, in Yugoslavia in 2000. Sometimes they're named after fruits or flowers, such as
Velvet also, right, in Czechoslovakia. The
sorry.
Velvet
Right.
Revolution in Czechoslovakia.
Yes, that was the first one of the so-called well, certainly the first post-Soviet revolution. Most people think these revolutions only started with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia was indeed the first of those. But when I started researching this color revolution technology, let's call it, this method, this technique, uh, I discovered that the first of these really modern, in its modern form, that is, the first modern color revolution was the Carnation Revolution, so called, in Portugal, which was in 1974. And that one was clearly staged by the British. Over a very British issue, that the British had this whole post-war plan that they were trying to quote unquote decolonize Africa. And what that really meant, the way they played it, the British presented this, is that they were going to liberate all these African countries, and they were going to be independent. But what the British actually intended to do is what they always do uh, when they uh, when they establish self-rule or independence in a colony, is that they find ways to maintain control quietly through back channels, through deals with the elites in the native elites in those countries, wherever they are. And so it's always very important for the British when they're relinquishing formal control over a colony. That's a very tense time for them when they're doing intense negotiation and making deals and setting up security arrangements that help them to maintain their neo-colonial control. And so this is what they were doing in Africa in the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, especially the 60s and 70s. And Portugal wasn't cooperating. Portugal had an extensive African empire, and the Portuguese were insisting that no, we're not going to give up our colonies, and they were fighting several colonial wars against guerrilla movements in their colonies. And the British just, they didn't want that. They wanted all the colonial powers to follow their lead and go along with their plan. And the Portuguese weren't doing it. So all of a sudden in 1974, there was a color revolution called the Carnation Revolution. The Portuguese government was overthrown and a new government installed by the British. that was completely cooperative with their decolonization plan in Africa. And so I discovered that, and I wrote an article about it back in maybe 2021, something like that. And I was really excited, thinking, oh, so I've discovered the earliest color revolution was 1974. But I quickly learned that actually it goes back much farther. Once I really understood that this was a British technique and that the British were the ones who had perfected it and were using it traditionally in their foreign policy, uh, once my eyes were really open to that fact, it started becoming very clear, and I saw that the French Revolution had also been a British color revolution. The Russian revolutions had been British color revolutions, and indeed, just about all of the revolutions in Europe during that whole period of the 19th century, let's say late 18th or early to mid 19th century, and going up as far as the Russian Revolution, the so-called Age of Revolution, and this includes the famous 1848 revolutions, which swept Europe in that year, all at once, breaking out all at once at the same time. And these revolutions, I came to understand. I came to be convinced that these too were British-inspired color revolutions, which had been led by Lord Palmerston. And I have to say that idea I first read uh, in an article by a guy named Webster Tarpley
Mm.
back in 1994, but I wasn't sure if it was true. It was a very interesting theory, but it wasn't sourced in such a way that I felt that it was verified. It seemed very plausible and very intriguing, but I spent many, many years just trying to really verify and make sure that this was true. And I'd say almost 30 years off and on. I'm not going to say this was my one obsession during all those decades, but uh, once I was hot on the trail, let's say starting in about, well, I don't know when it started, in the last few years, I went to great lengths to try to verify this, and I finally did. And I became convinced that Tarpley was right, that these 1848 revolutions were indeed uh, stage managed by Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister. He wasn't just a prime minister; he really he ran British foreign policy for uh, almost continuously for 35 years, from 1830 to his death in 1865. And he was three times foreign secretary, twice prime minister, a very, very powerful man at the time when the British Empire was arguably at its peak. When we speak of the Pax Britannica, and we speak of the golden age of Great Britain, this man, Palmerston, was in the seat of power at that time. He was the man who ran Britain's foreign policy, and he did it almost single-handedly. And he did not invent this technology of color revolutions. It had already been used in the French Revolution before him. But he, I think, raised it to a level where it had never been before. He used it so extensively, so many times, so boldly, so brazenly, and most spectacularly in instigating the American Civil War, most spectacularly and most tragically, creating the greatest crisis that our country has ever faced. And Lord Palmerston was behind it. He instigated it, and during the war, he supported the Confederacy. He supported the secessionists through every means available to him. He came very close to openly waging war against the United States.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, he placed 11,000 soldiers in Canada, and I think the French also had a huge amount of soldiers in Mexico preparing to join the war. And I think eventually the Russians helped the North, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. He actually, from the moment the war started, when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, Lord Palmerston immediately began garrisoning Canada, which of course was then a crown colony of England under direct British rule. It still is basically, but now they they spin it differently. But he began garrisoning Canada. He actually, by the end of 1861, I think he had as many as 18,000 British troops there, and he was attempting to raise an army of 100,000 Canadian militia from the Canadians. And the only reason that didn't work is the Canadians balked because they didn't want to pay for it. They didn't want to go to war with the United States for obvious reasons, because they're right on the border. They felt the British were pushing them into this war, and they wanted the British to pay for it. And the British balked. They were outraged. They thought it was so unpatriotic for the Canadians not to pay for it. Anyway, so if it hadn't been for that, if it hadn't been for the Canadian reluctance to raise this army and pay for it, there would have been well over 100,000 British troops on our border with extremely hostile intent. Meanwhile, in Mexico, as you mentioned, there was actually an invasion of three countries: Great Britain, Spain, and France, all invaded Mexico in I forget which month, but in 1861, and they invaded Mexico on the pretext of a sovereign debt default. They were supposedly going in to collect the debt and put in a government that would take responsibility for the debt. But in actual fact, it's obviously the American Civil War was already going on, and the purpose was to secure Mexico for the powers that were allied against us, and that was specifically Britain. The whole alliance was led by Britain, France under the Emperor Louis Napoleon III, who had actually been, you could say, installed by Britain in a color revolution. He did a coup against the French Republic and became the French emperor and dictator with British support and sponsorship. So it was England and basically their henchmen, Louis Napoleon III, and Spain was also joining them on various of these endeavors. And so they all three together invaded Mexico. The French took the lead. They installed a puppet ruler, the Emperor Maximilian, who was an Austrian prince. And they set up a monarchy in Mexico, which was under French control, and they fought a bloody civil war to suppress the Mexican nationalist forces who were defending the republic. And so all this was happening while America was torn in two in the Civil War, and the French ended up putting in as many as 40,000 troops in Mexico, and the British had 18,000 in Canada, and they were trying to raise an army of 100,000 Canadian militia. But more importantly than these ground troops was the British fleet. The British plan in the Civil War is they wanted to force Lincoln to accept a negotiated peace whereby the two halves of the country would separate, the North from the South. And they began pushing for this within the first few weeks of the war, saying, oh, this is terrible. Americans should not be fighting each other. Let's have a peace conference, and with the British officiating, the British leading it, arbitrating it. And of course, everyone knew what that meant. If the British provided arbitration, they were going to arbitrate the United States right out of existence. That was their plan. And they,
Richard, please allow me for a second. It's a little bit confusing because it seems like at this time of the Civil War, the British interest is to break America and to support the secession countries, and of course to continue to use their resources like the cotton. I understand that maybe up to 80% of all the cotton and tobacco was being sold to Britain as part of this globalist earlier stage. But I don't understand, why is it that they want to destroy the US when later they actually want to find a way to bring the US back into the British hegemony and use it as a powerful force to engage all the wars and fight all the wars and all the things that we are seeing in the 20th century? It seems like they changed their model.
well, I don't think it was a change of their underlying model. It was a change of strategy based on the reality of the situation. As long as they thought they could divide the United States, that seemed like a good plan to them, because then they would have two countries that were much weaker to deal with, and they would be able to control them more easily. But they would still have just as many men in them if they needed Americans to fight. They could they could bring both the North and the South into their wars if they wanted, and they still had the same resources. They still had the same cotton from the South. They still had the same agricultural resources from the North that they wanted. And they could still obtain these, whether it was one country or two. But if it were two countries, they could play them off against each other and keep them divided, and it would be easier to control them. Later, after the North won the Civil War and became very powerful militarily, that was not a practical thing to do. It was not a practical plan, so they changed the plan. And this is something that, the British are very good at this game of manipulating and controlling other countries. And this scenario they had done many times before, including the change of tactics. For example, when Lord Palmerston, in particular, first became Foreign Secretary in 1830, his first big project was to intervene in the Dutch Civil War that was starting at that time, started in, I think, August 1830. And basically, the southern provinces of the Netherlands wanted to break away and form a new country called Belgium. And they were saying, well, our rights are not being respected. We're Catholic, and we're being oppressed by the Protestants, and they're taking away our freedom of speech, etc., etc. So whatever pretext there was, they had their reasons to want to break away, and the British were stage managing it behind the scenes. The British wanted Belgium to break away, to be a separate country that would be forever neutral. And the reason they wanted this at that time was to block the power
Germany.
of France. And no, it wasn't Germany at that point. They were worried about France.
But I think
French
they knew that Germany will have to invade France eventually in a war through Belgium, and they had the alliance to prevent that and to bring them into the war. Don't you agree?
Well, I do agree that that's what eventually happened, and I'm sure the British were already anticipating that. But remember, this is 1830. Germany didn't actually exist.
Correct. Yeah.
There was Prussia, and there were all these German states. Now, the Germans as a people were still a formidable power. I mean, Prussia had been very important in stopping Napoleon. But at that point, and again, this goes to my point that the British changed their tactics and changed their priorities depending on the shifting situation. At that point in 1830, the British were still concerned about France, because France under Napoleon had conquered all of Europe and had almost succeeded in causing breaking the whole British trade system. Napoleon was trying to get all the countries of Europe to blockade, to boycott British shipping, and basically to put the British trade empire out of business. and he was getting all these countries to cooperate with that. So the British were still very concerned about France in 1830. They had only beaten Napoleon in 1815. So at that point, their focus was still on containing France, and that was their prime goal in wanting an independent Belgium. But my point about how the shifting tactics go, back in, I think it was in 1815, the British actually supported combining Belgium with Holland, with the Netherlands, for the same purpose, to stop France, to contain France. But then 15 years later, because of various new developments, they started getting worried that the Dutch might ally themselves with France, or France might get involved in the Dutch Civil War and make Belgium a French protectorate. So the British went in there to head off the French and make sure that Belgium was an English protectorate, which they did by taking control of the process and making sure that the Belgian separatists chose as their king, as the king of the Belgians, as they called him, this Prince Leopold, who became Leopold I of Belgium. And he had been married, he was the widower of an English princess, Charlotte, who had died. And then he was part of the what is essentially the British royal family of Saxe-Coburg. He was a favorite uncle of Princess Victoria, who became Queen Victoria, and he was a very well-known British puppet, if you want to call him that. He was known for supporting British policies all over Europe. So the British installed him as the first king of Belgium. So anyway, I'm just pointing out that you said you thought it was confusing. Why would the British want to break up the United States in 1861, but then in 19, let's say, well, 1901 would be a good hallmark year. They were pushing for a strong United States that was expansive and getting interested in supporting the British Empire all over the world, building a navy, all that. Well, it was a change of strategy because they saw they couldn't stop the United States from growing and getting more powerful. And that's when they formulated this plan of the Round Table. Well, it became the Round Table plan later. But initially, it was simply a plan of British elites, the British nobility, the British financial elites, the British oligarchy, if you will, and that Judge Cohalan, we were talking about earlier, in his testimony to the US Senate, he spoke a great deal about the British oligarchy and the fact that England was not, in fact, a democracy. It was not even, in his opinion, a constitutional monarchy, but it was an oligarchy led by certain families whom he said had been wielding power in Britain since the time of Henry VIII. And this is what he testified to the US Senate in 1919. So anyway, it was simply an adaptation to the new reality that it wasn't going to be easy to get the United States to break up at that time. And so they adapted their plan to a strong and united United States and said, we can work with that. And the way to work with it was to infiltrate and penetrate our government and our elites through their intelligence services, which they did with great effectiveness, especially during the administration of Woodrow Wilson, and especially through the agency of that man I mentioned before, Colonel William House.
And Weissman that you mentioned, which was a very famous MI6 agent.
Yes, Wiseman.
Mm-hmm.
So they basically ran the Woodrow Wilson administration, and it was in that administration that many changes occurred in the way our country is governed. We got a federal income tax. We got the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 establishing the Federal Reserve Bank, which has been a terrible problem for our country ever since. And all of these measures, and including America's entry into World War One in support of Great Britain, all of these measures were very much against American tradition, against the American uh, policy, which was what we now call an America First policy. We did not have a globalist policy at that time. Our policy was a regional policy, to be a regional power and to stay out of European power politics. We were brought into this arena by the machinations of Colonel House, in particular, him personally. And
even against even against the promise of Woodrow Wilson. I think he ran on the idea that he will keep America isolated from the wars, and then
well, yes, and I wouldn't say isolated. Actually, this term isolated and the term isolationism are themselves propaganda terms, which were introduced by these Anglophilic pro-British forces in America in order to create a pejorative connotation to the idea of having our own foreign policy. This was called isolation, and it was
Mhm.
deemed to be a bad thing, that to be isolated from the world. But it was the purpose of America's traditional policy, which was first formulated by George Washington, was simply to avoid entanglement and permanent alliances with European powers, which were always fighting each other. They were always involved in wars. And obviously, any alliance that we formed with any of them would immediately involve us in a war.
Mhm.
And it was for this reason that Washington said we should not entangle ourselves in such alliances. Now, he was not advising isolation. America has never been isolated. We, from our very beginning, we have always had interests all over the world. We always had very strong trade interests on all of the seven seas, in Asia, in Europe, in every part of the world. In fact, the first foreign war that we fought under Thomas Jefferson was the war against the Barbary pirates in North Africa, because
Yes.
they once the British withdrew their protection from our trade ships in the Mediterranean, the British actually told the Barbary pirates, "You can attack the American ships now; they're no longer under our protection." So we had to fight several wars actually, but principally one big war against the Barbary pirates, and it was on the other side of the world, and it was against these Muslim warlords who were ruling in North Africa and who were vassals of the Ottoman Empire. So we were essentially fighting the Ottoman Empire, and this was very soon after we became a nation. So we never hesitated to fight, and to fight very far from home in order to protect our interests. But our policy was not to get into a permanent alliance with any foreign nation which would oblige us to get involved in wars that were not in our own interests. See,
Yes.
that's the key.
I understand. I would like for you to speak about all the revolutionary powers, for example, Lenin and Karl Marx and others that were hosted in London. They visited London. I think Lenin was there, if I remember from your research, 6 times, and Karl Marx was there. And I would like for you to explain how they are weaponizing those revolutionaries, and if you can maybe speak a little bit about the Bolshevik Revolution and in what way did it serve the British, and how did they allow the Bolshevik to win against huge resistance?
Sure.
It will connect us to the idea of communism eventually, and then how they actually used that to blame it on the Jews and all the propaganda that we are seeing today.
Right. Under Lord Palmerston said that the three countries that were England's greatest rivals were France, Russia, and the United States of America. And this was because at the time he said that, which I think was 1850 or something thereabouts, he said these were the three countries that were the most likely to overpower England on the seas, to replace England as the great sea power of the world. So at that time, in his view, these were France, Russia, and the United States of America, and it was his contention to the end of his days that British policy should be to weaken those three countries. Now, later, after his death, the situation changed. Germany was unified in 1871, I think, and it became a very rapidly industrializing power. It began rapidly building a fleet, and so the subsequent generation of British leaders focused on Germany and Russia as the chief threat, and their strategy toward France and the United States, which they had previously regarded as great threats, their strategy was to form alliances with France and the United States and to make these countries, to bring them into cooperation with the British and to be useful to the British in their ends. And this succeeded very well for them. And so beginning, let's say in the 1870s, 1880s, British policy began focusing very tightly on Germany and Russia as the chief enemies. And so in World War I, the British policy, their secret policy actually was that while they were allied with Russia, the British had made an alliance of convenience with the Tsar, the Russian Empire, to defeat Germany. Their secret policy was actually that they wanted both Germany and Russia to lose the war. And this was enunciated by certain British officials privately, that the best outcome for Britain in World War I was for Germany to lose the war, but Russia not to win it, is the way it was phrased. And this is exactly what happened. And so the plan that they formulated was that they would use Russia against Germany as long as Russia's strength lasted, to wear them out. But then at an opportune moment, they would take Russia out through a color revolution, which was their normal method of doing things, and replace Russia with the United States. And they were 100% certain that this replacement could take place because, as I described before, this was the administration of Woodrow Wilson, and British intelligence, represented in America by this Wiseman guy. They were completely in control of the White House, completely in control of the executive power of the United States through this man, Colonel House, who was being run by Wiseman and by the British establishment generally, by the British Foreign Office. They knew with 100% certainty that America had already agreed to enter the war and would more than adequately replace Russia and deliver the death blow to Germany. So this was all planned. And Britain's rivalry with Russia goes back many centuries. Britain had always seen Russia as a principal enemy. And this was partly because, well, it was mainly because Russia threatened. It was the most powerful European country that was in a position to threaten British control of the trade routes to the east, and even to directly threaten India. which was a very important colony for Britain and the British trade system. And then, as World War I approached, oil was discovered in the Middle East in the early 1900s. And just at the moment when the whole technology of the world was switching from coal and steam technology to petroleum-based technology, and especially the technology for powering ships and war fleets. It was switching from coal to oil, and suddenly they discovered enormous quantities of oil in what was then called Persia, Iran, as we
Yes.
call it today. So this was yet another reason to take out Russia, because in the years just before World War I, they discovered enormous oil fields in Iran. And these were the first Middle Eastern oil fields to be discovered. And Iran was controlled by Russia and England. Russia controlled the northern part, England controlled the southern part. And so during the war, excuse me,
Of course.
at a certain point during the war, as Russia was wearing out, and I think by 1915, Russia's position was already really insupportable. They were losing very badly. They were being attacked on three fronts by the Germans, the Austrians, and the Turks, and they were retreating on three fronts. They were receiving offers from the Central Powers to make a separate peace, and they were entertaining these offers. So that's when the British made a deal with them and said, look, we want you to stay in the war, stay with us till the bitter end, and in the event that we win, you will get Constantinople. We will give you Constantinople, and then, which the Russians had wanted for centuries, so they could have their own outlet into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this, I believe, was a trick, and I argue this in my book, that the British could not possibly have had any intention whatever of honoring that agreement. The British foreign policy for centuries had been to prevent the Russians from getting Constantinople. They had fought many wars over this. It was one of the bedrock principles of British policy that the Russians must not be allowed access to the Mediterranean Sea, because they had their Black Sea fleet bottled up in the Black Sea, and the British policy had been to prop up the Ottoman Empire and to maintain the Ottomans in power long after they were viable, specifically to prevent Constantinople from falling to the Russians. So now all of a sudden, the English said, stay in the war, hang in there, fight with us to the bitter end, we'll give you Constantinople. But in return for Constantinople, we want you to give us more land, more of the oil fields of Iran. And the Russians agreed to this. So they gave the British a bigger share of the Iranian territory. But what happened is, because of the Russian Revolution, and specifically the Bolshevik Revolution, which, the first revolution unseated the Tsar, the second revolution installed the Bolsheviks, but it was the second one that counted for the British, because they had installed, that is, the British had installed their man, their agent, Leon Trotsky, who was a British agent. There's huge evidence for this. And they had installed Trotsky as the foreign minister. They called him the foreign commissar for the Bolsheviks. And I think within 2 weeks of the revolution, of the Bolsheviks taking power, Trotsky repudiated all secret agreements that had been made by the Tsarist government, including the agreement to give Constantinople to Russia. He
Mhm.
repudiated that agreement, which was of great value to Russia. It would even have been of great value to the Bolsheviks, but he repudiated it in a move that served nobody's interests except those of Great Britain.
He also gave up the north part of Iran, right?
Yes,
He said we have no imperialistic.
yes.
Um,
This Trotsky, who I contend was a British agent, he repudiated all Russian claims whatsoever in Persia, in Iran. And
Incredible.
the de facto result of this was that all of Persia and all of the Persian oil fields came under British control, and the British assigned these oil rights to a company. It was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and this became British Petroleum. It was later
BP.
renamed British Petroleum.
Yes.
And this was the origin of Britain's uh, ascent as a great petroleum power and a great power in the Middle East. And of course, at the same time that, or shortly after, Trotsky was making these extraordinary concessions to Great Britain, the British then claimed almost the entire territory of the Middle East. The French got some of it, but the British got most of it. And the French at that point were basically under British control anyway. So in one fell swoop, they took control of this huge new resource that no one had known or cared about before, which was the oil fields of the Middle East. And it all began with this deal that they made with the Bolsheviks, with Trotsky in particular. And the other Bolsheviks went along with it too. I focus on Trotsky in my book mainly because he was the one who was most clearly and obviously a British agent. There's the evidence of it is overwhelming, including the fact that he was actually accused and he was and tried for this in Soviet court in the so-called treason trials
In
in
the
the late
30s,
30s.
right? In the
Sorry,
30s, he was blamed to actually be an agent of Britain in the 30s.
I don't understand the last
Nine,
bit.
1930s, there were like trials, and
Oh
of
yes,
course,
the 30s, exactly.
yes.
The treason trials, I think, from 1936 to 1938.
Hmm.
The entire point of these trials was basically to say that Trotsky was a British agent and that all these other people were Trotskyists and therefore that they were foreign spies. They also accused him of spying for Japan and Germany and maybe others, but principally he was accused of spying for the British and of being their agent. And of course, a Soviet show trial is not the most definitive authority on who's guilty of what, but there's so much corroborating evidence. There was the chief witness against Trotsky was a Soviet diplomat named Christian Rakovsky, who confessed that he had been recruited by British intelligence in London, and they had used some sort of forged letter to frame him for some crime that would have gotten him probably executed back in Russia. And this forged letter was used to blackmail him and recruit him. And he was given to understand that Trotsky had knowledge of this, Trotsky being his superior as foreign commissar. So Rakovsky testified that he returned to Russia and he spoke to Trotsky, and Rakovsky claimed that Trotsky admitted to him that he was working for British intelligence, and that from now on, Trotsky allegedly said that he and Rakovsky would both be working for British intelligence. Now, I think this conversation took place in 1924, but as you mentioned before, Harry, there's evidence that not only Trotsky but other top Bolsheviks had been recruited and groomed by the British going back to the early 1900s. In Trotsky's case, at least as early as 1902, he was in London, and I think Lenin was there at the same time. I believe Stalin may also have been present on that trip. They stayed for a long time. They set up a newspaper in London, and they were invited, and they were sponsored, if you will, by very high level British politicians, British elites, ruling class people who were, in some cases, of the aristocracy, but people who were very much part of the ruling circles in Britain at the time, and who groomed them and encouraged them and probably actually recruited them as British agents at that time, uh, and arranged for them to have all kinds of support. And this was even before the 1905 revolution in Russia. Now, the significance of this, these dates that they were there before the 1905 revolution, is that there's no question that the British were the ones who caused the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese soundly defeated the Russian Empire and broke their power and caused a very serious uprising against the Tsar, the 1905 revolution, which forced the Tsar to accept a constitution of sorts, to create a Duma, a representative government, and so forth. And this was the beginning of the end for the Tsarist regime, because once those institutions were established, once the precedent had been established of all these revolutionary groups having legitimacy in a parliament, from there, the regime was doomed. And so this whole thing was clearly engineered by the British. The British had developed Japan as a rival to Russia in the East, and the British had built the entire Japanese Navy for them in British shipyards and trained them to run this navy, and with this British, and then encouraged them to make war on Russia. This is all very well known. And so, on the one hand, the British had built up Japan and used them to deliver a crushing military blow against the Tsar. And at the same time, in London, they were developing these Bolshevik revolutionaries to undermine Russia from within. And they made multiple trips to London for this purpose, to meet with their British supporters and to organize their revolutionary networks abroad, in London and in Switzerland in particular. And during this time, the Russo-Japanese War happened, the 1905 revolution happened in Russia, and then World War I happened. And everything had been prepared and planned to instigate the Russian Revolution, that was called the February Revolution, to remove the Tsar, then the so-called October Revolution to put in the Bolsheviks. But even then, and this is a point I make very strongly in my book, because Americans don't understand this for the most part, the Bolshevik Revolution did not put the communists in power. It was a coup whereby overnight they seized power in the capital, which was then called Petrograd. And shortly thereafter, they seized power in Moscow and a few other places. But the whole Russian Empire was against them. They didn't control the rest of the empire. The rest of the Russian Empire was disunited. It was in chaos. And there were very large military forces under Russian commanders who were still loyal to the old regime and who wanted nothing to do with communism. And so the Bolsheviks, who were communists, of course, they did not succeed in taking control of Russia for another well, let's say at least 4 years. I mean, probably in 1921 is probably the year when you would say that they really took control. Because until then, we had the Russian Civil War. This was a huge war in which many different forces were fighting. The so-called White Russians, who were the remnants of the old Russian military, who were against the revolution. They were fighting a counter-revolution. But in addition to the White Russians, there were many separatist nationalist forces, all encouraged and stirred up by the British in their usual way, through covert operations. And the Poles declared independence, the Finns declared independence, Ukraine, and many other countries or area. They weren't countries then; they were provinces of the Russian Empire, but ethnic areas that were dominated by some particular ethnic or language group. They declared themselves independent, and all of them had the support of the British and the encouragement of the British, who had been encouraging them for many years, even more than they had been encouraging the Bolsheviks, or as much as they had been. So it wasn't only the Bolsheviks who had been propped up by the British in anticipation of creating this enormous catastrophe, the destruction of the Russian Empire. It was all the various nationalities. I would say, especially the Poles. The Poles, the Polish nationalists had been sponsored by the British uh, for many decades, going back into the early 19th century, but with special intensity beginning in the late 19th century. It was always the British goal to cause uprisings in Poland and eventually to have a Poland, an independent Poland created, which would serve as a buffer between the Russian Empire and the rest of Europe. And so, just to say that all of these forces were fighting and each had their own agenda. Many of them were fighting against the Bolsheviks. Sometimes they fought with the Bolsheviks. But the real issue, which I make in my book, is that the British were totally in control of this process because they had sponsored and created all of these revolutionary and separatist movements. All of these movements were, to some degree, dependent on the British for supplies, for arms, for financial support, but especially and including the White Russian forces. They were essentially run by the British War Office. They would not make any move, that is, the White Russians, without getting permission from Winston Churchill, who was the war secretary at the time. They were doing everything they could to cooperate with Churchill because they knew that if they stepped out of line, then the British government could do something to harm them or undermine them, such as cutting off their funding or not giving them permission to do certain moves or operations they wanted to do, or betraying them in negotiations with the Bolsheviks and or any of these separatist groups, which did not have the same interests as the White Russians, because the White Russians wanted to restore the empire. They didn't want to have any of these other ethnic groups declare independence. So the British created a kind of a perfect storm where there was just there were so many different forces, all basically against each other, all fighting in this single theater of the former Russian Empire. And because they were all divided and because they were all beholden to England one way or the other, because they were all courting England's favor one way or the other, that put the British completely in charge of the situation. And this then raises the question, why did the Bolsheviks win? If the British were in a position, and I contend that they were, the British were clearly in a position to determine the outcome of the Russian Civil War. They were in a position to determine who was going to win and who was going to lose. And those who won, for the most part, were those the British wanted to win. Poland got its independence. Finland got its independence. The Baltic states got their independence. Ukraine did not get its independence. That's one uh, aspect where it did not go according to the original British plan. Also, the Caucasus, the British ended up having to negotiate that away. When the revolution first happened, the British put a force of 40,000 men into the Caucasus in order to seize the Russian oil fields, and they wanted to create an independent Caucasus state as a British protectorate, which would give the British control of the Russian oil. And so you see the master plan. The British had already gotten control of the Persian oil, the Iranian oil. They wanted simultaneously to get control of the Russian oil, and they had actually occupied militarily those oil fields. They eventually gave them up. I don't know what kind of deal they made with the Bolsheviks, but I suspect they did make some kind of deal. And a lot of people don't realize, by the way, they believe the propaganda that the communists somehow just nationalized everything and kicked out all the capitalists. It is totally not true. The Bolsheviks made deals with all of the capitalist powers, but especially with England, with Britain, which was controlling the whole process. It was handled just as all regime changes, just as all transitions, as we were talking about before, transitions from a colonial state to a post-colonial state. The British handled the transition to Bolshevism in exactly the same way. Basically, deep down inside, the British didn't care what kind of government ran Russia. They simply wanted to make sure their interests were protected, that they had agreements, they had deals to protect their interests. And it was all a big negotiation to make sure that that happened. And the Russian Civil War was no different. But the result of it for the Russians and for the rest of the world is that they got the first communist regime that ever existed. It was a very brutal regime, and we all know the terrors, the horrors of the so-called Red Terror, and what came after. But this communist regime, like I would contend, like all the others that came after it, the so-called Soviet conquest of half of Europe, the Chinese Revolution, whereby China became communist, the Vietnam War, the Korean War. If you look at the whole history of communism, it always played out in a way very similar to the Russian Civil War, where initially some group of communists, some ragtag band of revolutionaries who by their nature simply did not have any ability. They didn't have the funding, they didn't have the arms, they didn't have the support of the people, they didn't have any physical means or ability to take over a country, but somehow they took it over anyway. And when you look into it, what you find is it's always that somehow they were sponsored and supported and allowed to take over, even while an illusion was created that somehow these Western capitalist countries were supposedly opposing them and supposedly trying to defeat them. In fact, it wasn't happening. And in my book, I allude to this phenomenon by calling the Russian Civil War, I call it the Vietnam before Vietnam, because the way this war really established the same template that was later followed in by America in the Vietnam War, where you had supposed communist insurgents who were supposedly taking over this country, and we, the greatest power in the world, were supposedly trying to stop them. And somehow, for some mysterious reason, we were totally unable to stop them. And supposedly they defeated us. And when you really look at the facts, you find it's just not true. They didn't defeat us. They never defeated us. They never had the means to defeat us. We simply allowed them to take over the country while going through this whole elaborate uh, elaborate and very bloody pretense of pretending to oppose them. We actually weren't opposing them, and it seems crazy. It seems that you would ask yourself, why would we do such a thing? Why would we allow such a thing to happen? But the fact is, it did happen, and the literally the entire history of communism and the advance of communism throughout the world always took place according to this same template, where communist groups, whom, if you look deeply enough, you can find they were sponsored by powers in the West, and usually and almost entirely by Great Britain. It was specifically Great Britain, I contend, that created this game of using revolutions to expand its power. And you find that Great Britain specifically, sometimes other countries, in imitation of Great Britain and with their supervision and in alliance with them, but you find Western countries sponsoring these revolutionaries, and then you find some kind of conflict breaking out, such as the Russian Civil War or the Vietnam War or so many other wars like them. And then you find the communists winning time after time after time, and with no real explanation for it. So, and this, I would mention, sorry.
Richard, if I may, I think you made a very interesting point in one of your articles that I read, or maybe one of your interviews, that basically the liberal imperialism of the power elite in Britain, which is more like a socialist imperialism, is like an attack on the middle class, the bourgeois, because of the industrial revolution, which became a threat to the elite, and to use or to weaponize the poor to eventually lead them to some kind of a communist revolt, which will bring a new, something like feudalism 2.0. Uh, and it's like mind blowing to understand that it's basically maybe the main reason for why they are doing all of that. Can you explain or expand on that?
Yes, the British philosophy, which you can find in many British writings by many British leaders, including Lord Palmerston, the one I mentioned before. He spoke of this. He gave speeches about it. But the British philosophy was always that revolution is inevitable, that change is always happening, and that you should not resist change. That if that when you see what the people supposedly want, you should listen to the people and give them what they want. That this is the way to increase your power, and the way to prevent violent revolution. And so, on the home front in England itself, as the Industrial Revolution uh, progressed in England, with all of the well-known hardships to industrial workers, the long hours, the poor pay, the insecurity, and women and children having to work long hours alongside the men, and all these the miseries of the Industrial Revolution. So England dealt with this by from starting very early to implement socialist reforms, to implement socialism itself, to promote socialism as an ideology, and to enact laws that would ameliorate the condition of the working class. Short, excuse me.
You're talking, for example, about the Fabian Society, right?
Yes, that's part of it. Groups like the Fabians and other groups. The one that I focused on is called, in my book, it's called Young England. And I think this was really the original such group. And it supposedly emerged in the 1830s. But this was a movement of the British aristocracy, of the landed aristocrats.
Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Sure. I told you my voice would wear out.
Yeah, I'm worried now.
So these young England people, they were British aristocrats who they allied themselves with the left, with socialists, with communists, with the early communist movements in England, and their narrative that they were pushing is that they said that all of these horrors of the industrial age are caused by the middle class, by the nouveau riche, by these people who have become newly rich through entrepreneurship, through starting businesses, through engaging in trade, and so forth, and that they're rising up and they're becoming very wealthy and very powerful and ruthless, and that they are oppressing the people who used to be the peasants, who are now coming to the cities and becoming the working class. So these aristocrats said the problem is that these middle class people don't understand how to run society. They're just too greedy, they're too ambitious, and they don't have the training in how to have the sort of noble, generous spirit that the aristocracy supposedly has always had.
Yeah.
And so what they said is we should return to a feudal system where the aristocracy is in control and where the poor and the working class are basically serfs who are controlled and protected by the nobility, and the middle class will be totally wiped out. And so they were openly preaching this, and so their argument was that the aristocracy should support communism, should support socialism, and should support these revolutionaries. And they argued that this would prevent bloody revolutions of the sort that were already starting to break out in places in Europe. So what I discovered is there's a continuous strand between these original aristocrats of the Young England movement, and it continually throughout the 19th century, right up to the Russian Revolution, where these blue bloods, these aristocrats, and particularly in England, were supporting communist movements, and for exactly that reason, because they believed that certain changes are inevitable, democratization, economic equality, and so forth. But the way for the ruling classes to maintain their wealth, to maintain their power, is to turn the poor against the middle class and to help the poor exterminate the middle class, and be grateful and beholden to the upper classes. And so it was from this movement, which started in England under the name of Young England, but it eventually spread throughout Europe through a British-sponsored network, which came to be called Young Europe. Actually, the Young England wasn't formally the first. I think the first one was called Young Italy. It was started by the Italian revolutionary Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini. I believe he started it in 1830 or 31, just when Palmerston was taking power as foreign secretary. And it spread all over Europe. There was a young France, a young Germany, young Poland, young everything. It was basically an underground revolutionary network that had chapters in all these countries, and including a young America. And in my forthcoming book, which you kindly mentioned, Who Killed Lincoln? The Case Against England, I contend that the conspirators who conspired to kill Lincoln were part of this Young America network, which in turn was a sister organization to the Young Europe network, which was tied to this Young England that I just described. These were all, uh, in their origin, British influence networks, which were run ultimately by Lord Palmerston in England during the years when he was Foreign Secretary and then Prime Minister. And the purpose of it was to foster this young England philosophy, to encourage revolutions uh, for the purpose of extinguishing and exterminating the middle class and making the poor dependent on the ruling classes. And of course, essential in this system is for the ruling classes to stay behind the scenes and not be observed uh, carrying out these intrigues. And so this is how we got the myth of these communist states, which supposedly nationalize everything and supposedly refuse to do business with the West, when in fact they are doing business with the West all the time and always have been. And it's kept very, very quiet.
I see. Richard, how, because we are talking about hegemony that controls basically everything according to your research, how do you understand today's current events, for example, in Europe, even in England itself, in the US, with multiculturalism, the destruction of the culture, massive immigration, especially of jihadi minds? Uh, in what way does it serve the British now? And what does it say about them in relation to their own people? What do you think about all of that?
Well, I think your question presumes, I do contend that the British to this very day are still controlling this globalist system. I can't see any point when they would have lost control. I think the troubles that England is having right now, where it appears that their whole country, their economy is collapsing, and supposedly they're being overrun by these foreign invaders, this mass immigration. But I would contend that this is simply another continuation of the same strategy they've had all along, which is to continually create huge catastrophes, and catastrophes which affect their own people quite often. I mean, think of the world wars, which I believe in their were ultimately planned and created by the British. Well, millions of British people suffered and died in those wars, and this was all to simply continue to break down the old structures and to make way for the new structure, this third British Empire that Alfred Zimmern wrote about in 1926. The end of the Second Empire, the beginning of the Third Empire. What it requires is a vast worldwide strategy of divide and conquer, divide and rule, to get everybody fighting against each other, and in particular, that any forces which might remain, which want to hang on to the old order, in this case, let's say, of nation states, who want to be patriotic, who want to be proud of their country, who want to preserve their country. Well, these forces have to be vilified and attacked and controlled. And so bringing in these huge numbers of foreign elements, especially Muslim, uh, in Europe, certainly, they're bringing in a hostile force which is going to terrify and perhaps ultimately fight the people who are already there. And why are they doing that? Why do they want to do that? Well, it's difficult to predict right now, other than the fact that we know it has always been their plan. They've written about it continuously for more than 100 years. They want to end nationalism. They see nationalism as a force which is opposed to their global government that they want to establish. The very existence of nation states, the very existence of ethnicities, of tribal groupings which are loyal to themselves, which want to preserve themselves. This is anathema to the kind of global system they want to create. So I can't predict what exactly they're planning for Europe and for Britain itself by bringing all these foreigners in. But clearly, when you create a situation like this, when a government creates any kind of situation so hostile and disadvantageous to its own people, it's always for the same reason. It's because they want to make the people so frightened, so angry, and so desperate that they'll be willing to accept some kind of huge change, maybe a change in the form of government, maybe a war. One thing they may actually want a civil war. They may want religious war. They may want a crusade. There are a lot of forces right now, which you can see in social media on Twitter, that are expressly calling for a new crusade and using imagery from the Crusades of knights in armor,
Hmm.
crusader banners, and the idea of a rejuvenated Christianity, which which would support a crusader spirit. And so there's obviously a very organized effort to revive that kind of crusader spirit and to organize people around that idea. And so having a huge invasion of Europe by the quote unquote infidel, of course, would be the perfect it would be the perfect preparation for getting people to buy into a new crusade. And
It's
I'm
a
not.
it's like a dialectical political warfare. It's like creating some kind of a problem and then anticipating, actually not anticipating, but waiting. No, the mission is the reaction. The mission is the reaction. The people are going to react in a certain way, and this is going to eventually advance this post-nationalistic system and structure. And it connects so well with all the international organizations that the British themselves created already, which are affecting our life in every possible way.
Yes, exactly. And it is, as you say, it is the Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. You create a problem, in this case, mass immigration. You get the reaction. People are horrified. People are angry. Uh, and then you offer the solution. What is the solution that's going to be offered? I'm not sure. I can't predict the future, but it's not going to be something good. I'm reasonably sure. It's going to be something that's against the interests of the people of Europe, the people of America, the people who are the targets of these operations. It's not going to be something that we want. It's going
Yes.
to be expressly something that we don't want, which is why all of this preparation and provocation and agitation is necessary. It's to get us to accept something that we would never accept otherwise.
Yeah. By the way, I wonder if you knew that in March 21 this year, Trump responded positively on Truth Social to reports that King Charles III might offer the U.S. associate membership in the Commonwealth, and Trump said that he is positively responding to that. And today, I think he's visiting in the U.K. in England. Did you hear about that?
I did hear about that at the time. I was never able to satisfy myself that it was true. There were people saying it was fake news, and as usual, when you get these rumors, someone will report something, but I'm not convinced he ever did say such a thing, or if he might have flippantly said, "Oh, sounds like a good idea," just as a joke. I
I,
really don't know.
I was trying to find a video where he's actually speaking and saying it, and I couldn't find. But what I found was different news anchors speaking about that as if it happened. Yes, it requires further research and verification. Um, Richard, I would like to speak before we end it on the Jewish angle, and especially the power plays of the British Empire in regards to the creation of Zionism, and in what way the existence of Israel served them, and how do they play Iran, for example, or other jihadi countries, and what do you think about what happened in 7th of October and what might happen later? Like, if you can give us a brief description of what you understand about the Israeli side of the picture.
Okay, well, briefly, this whole plot, this whole conspiracy, if you will, that I described, of establishing this network of young Europe, young France, young Germany, young Italy, young America, establishing this underground revolutionary network all over Europe and using it to instigate revolutions. And even before the network, instigating the French Revolution, as I demonstrate in my book, that the British did in fact instigate and largely control the course of that revolution. So this whole vast network that was created by British intelligence, that was run by Lord Palmerston, it is my contention that modern anti-Semitism, as we know it today, and I'm specifically talking about the modern brand of anti-Semitism, which specifically says that Jews, and especially Jewish bankers and financiers, are involved in a conspiracy to foment revolutions, and that they have fomented all these revolutions of modern times in the so-called age of revolution. It is my contention that the accusation that this was a Jewish conspiracy, this accusation was a British intelligence narrative that was created for the specific purpose of deflecting from the British role in this very real conspiracy, the conspiracy to foment all these revolutions. They were indeed connected, and they were indeed, to a large extent, stage managed by a central controlling power. And I think this is very clear. And it was very clear to people back at the time of World War One, and that's why the British government at that time, as I document in my book, the British government actually engaged in an organized propaganda campaign to say just that, just what I said, that the Jews were supposedly the masterminds and the controllers and the fomenters of the Bolshevik Revolution. And Winston Churchill actually wrote a very famous article in February, I think it was February 8th of 1920. He was then the war secretary, and he was then, as we were talking about, Churchill was then in charge of the Russian Civil War. He was in charge of supplying, financing, and guiding all of the various British-sponsored forces in the Russian Civil War who were
Against the Bolsheviks, right?
against the Bolsheviks, but he was also secretly, and I have to imagine Churchill had knowledge of this, secretly the British were also supporting the Bolsheviks.
I think that I remember from one of your articles or interviews that you said that actually George Lloyd, right? He was the one forbidding Churchill from winning the war against the Bolsheviks.
Yes, Lloyd George was he was pro-Bolshevik. He was absolutely openly and unambiguously pro-Bolsheviks, in that he wanted the Bolsheviks to win. In terms of I don't know if he agreed with their ideology. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But these maneuvers are not about ideology. The ideologies are just a front. It's all about interests and power and gaining strategic advantage and resources. The ideologies are just a cover. So the thing is, yes, Churchill was supposedly ferociously anti-communist, and he supposedly wanted to defeat the Bolsheviks. I'm willing to grant that he was sincere in that, and I said so in my book. I don't see any evidence that he wasn't, but he must have known. He surely did know that others, the enemy he was facing, was not on the battlefield in Russia. They were his own colleagues in the British government, especially Lloyd George, the prime minister, who was openly opposing him in any measure he tried to take to oppose the Bolsheviks. So, in the midst of this, Churchill wrote this article on February 8th, 1920, in which he said that uh, the whole problem in Russia, the big problem that they're facing, is all caused by the Jews. That the Jews are the ones who are controlling the Bolsheviks. The Jews are the ones who created the Bolshevik movement in the first place, Churchill said. But then he went farther, and he said that the Jews are, in fact, the ones who have caused all of the revolutions of modern times, going back to the French Revolution.
I
He
think he
specifically said,
mentioned Adam Weishaupt. He
yeah,
connected it to this time.
correct, going back even farther than the French Revolution to the uprising, or the planned uprising, of the Bavarian Illuminati uh, under Adam Weishaupt. And Churchill mentioned this as also, he said, being a Jewish controlled movement.
Yeah.
So I began my book with this very interesting article of Churchill, and asked the question, why did he say this? Why was he blaming the Jews for not only the Bolshevik Revolution, but for every revolution of modern times, the 1848 revolutions, the French Revolution, etc., etc.? Why was he making such an enormous claim? And why was he doing it publicly as a high official of the British government, as the war secretary, and having such a sensitive assignment as he did of overseeing the war effort in the Russian Civil War? Why was he making such a provocative statement? And it was extremely provocative because the White Russian forces, whom Churchill was sponsoring and funding and helping, were, of course, committing tremendous atrocities against the Jewish population. And by saying these things, Churchill was basically endorsing what they were doing. And in fact, he did endorse General Denikin by name in that article. General Denikin was then fighting in what we now call Ukraine, and he was well, he had these irregular units called dobrovolci, these volunteers who were supposedly on their own committing pogroms and so forth against Jewish civilians, and Denikin was supposedly not responsible, but that's not true. I mean, it's very well documented that these dobrovolci units were under Denikin's command, and that he fully approved of these atrocities. And so the thing is, Winston Churchill, he was not only endorsing the underlying argument of the White Russians for why they were committing these atrocities, which is saying that the Jews were responsible for Bolshevism, but Churchill was also defending Denikin personally and specifically by saying, no, he's the protector of the Jews. He's not responsible for these Dobrovolci groups. And so this was a very sensitive life and death issue that was in Winston Churchill's hands. And why did he do something so provocative and so dangerous as to write such an article? So I concluded by studying that situation and studying the whole British propaganda campaign of the time. It wasn't just Churchill. I'm not blaming Churchill personally for this. He was following a government policy that was at least a faction of the British government was pursuing this policy to blame the Jews for the Bolshevik Revolution and for all revolutions going back 150 years or more. And under this campaign, the British government basically, I mean, they were basically operatives of British intelligence who had been involved with Russia during the war, uh, operatives of British military intelligence involved themselves in translating and publishing an official, the first British version of the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It was published by a government printing house that handles publications for crown copyright, such as the King James Bible and the Anglican Prayer Book and things like that. A very prestigious publishing house that does business with the crown. And they published this book. They published the protocols in English, the very first British edition of this book, as I understand. It had come out in Russian in 1903, but then they published it in England, and they gave it the title The Jewish Peril. And it was lavishly promoted in the British press, especially by the London Morning Post, which did a multi-part series on it, which was very sympathetic to the point of view of basically saying that there was, in fact, a Jewish conspiracy to conquer and enslave the world, and that the Bolshevik Revolution was an expression of this, and that right-thinking people, British people, good people needed to wake up and do something about it. And I believe it was actually in the London Times during this period, during this anti-Jewish British propaganda campaign. I think the London Times it was that actually said that perhaps we fought on the wrong side in World War One. That instead essentially said that instead of getting a Pax Germanica, we're getting a Pax Judaica. In other words, that the result of World War One has been that somehow the Jews have conquered the world. So all I'm saying is that this was an official propaganda campaign of the British government, in which Winston Churchill himself, Winston Churchill personally made himself the poster child of this campaign. And that simple fact, since my book was published in May of last year, it's very, very hard for me to get people to understand that's what I'm saying. I'm simply saying, look, the British government made this claim. And so we have to ask, why would they do it? What was their motivation? It's very hard to get past that simple factual assertion that I'm making, because everyone wants to say, how dare you say the Jews got blamed when Karl Marx was Jewish and this one was Jewish and that one was Jewish, blah, blah, blah. They just want to argue about whether it really was a Jewish conspiracy. And they're not getting the point. The point is, see, the very people, let's call them anti-Semites, the very anti-Semites who are making this argument, who are saying, yes, it is the Jews who control everything and do all these revolutions. So I say to them, well, okay, well, why did Winston Churchill and the British government say what you're saying? Why did they officially launch an anti Jewish propaganda campaign in 1920, basically, is when it was running? And they'll just say, oh, well, Churchill was a pawn of the Rothschilds. He was in debt to them. His father was in debt to them. He was just their pawn. And I'll say, wait a minute. If he was a pawn of the Jews, why was he accusing the Jews of being the most evil people in the world and of doing these revolutions? And I can't get back. I can't get past that point.
Yeah, not to mention the big elephant of the room is always the British Empire that controls 25% of the whole world, and in charge of everything. And the state of Israel, it doesn't even exist, and the people of the Jews are always being hunted and killed, and it's like just a scapegoat. That's all it is.
Right. Well, so the thing is, to me, I'm trying to get to the more interesting point. People aren't ready to go there yet. Is why, first of all, the fact that Churchill said this at all. Some people don't even want to believe it. But why did he say it as the war secretary of Great Britain in the middle of a war, the Russian Civil War, which was about this very issue? Why did he take this position? There was a reason for it. And the reason, as I believe I have shown in my book, is because it was actually the British secret intelligence services which had fomented all these revolutions, not just in Russia, but for the last 150 years. And the purpose of this propaganda campaign was to deflect attention from that fact because people were talking about it. There were Russian aristocrats who were writing memoirs and making and newspaper stories and making accusations against the British government, saying that the British betrayed us. That this was the accusation of these Russian aristocrats. They were saying the British told us we were going to get a nice liberal revolution, and so we went along with them, and instead we got the Bolsheviks. This was the great outrage from the Russian aristocracy. They had been promised a constitutional monarchy in which they would retain their positions, and instead they got the Bolsheviks, and many of them started figuring out they had been betrayed by the British, that the British had actually conned them and lied to them, and that they were planning to put in these Bolsheviks all along. And so because of this bad publicity, I think the British government decided to fan the flames of anti-Semitism and to make the Jews exclusively, let's use the word exclusively, responsible for this whole revolutionary phenomenon, not only in Russia, but going all the way back to the French Revolution and the Bavarian Illuminati. And it was, so in other words, it was an intelligence operation. It was a propaganda operation. And you can see, and I named some of the names in my book, that the personnel, the very people who were working this operation, were themselves associated with the British War Propaganda Bureau and other British agencies connected with military intelligence. It was clearly an intelligence operation whose purpose was to cover for another intelligence operation, which was the British fomenting these revolutions in the first place. So they had to say it was the Jews. And that's what
So,
my book says.
so why allowing the Balfour Declaration? Was it eventually to create a Zionist state here to perpetuate conflict in this area? Because where there is conflict, they can control better?
Well, everything in the British world order, which is now the United Nations world order, the Third British Empire, everything in the empire is based on divide and rule, the old Roman principle, that you don't want people to be at peace. You want people to be divided and angry and fighting all the time as a permanent state of affairs, because that makes it easy for you as the ruler to control them. Uh, and so the way the Romans did this, for example, during the years when the Roman Empire was supposedly collapsing and breaking up, what it was in a sense, it wasn't as united as it used to be, but during those long declining centuries, Rome remained powerful. The Roman Imperium, the Roman emperor remained powerful because even though he had all of these foreign armies invading his empire and setting up rival kingdoms, the Germans in particular, all these Germanic tribes, the Vandals, and so forth, the emperor was always powerful because he always kept them fighting against each other. He would turn one German tribe against another German tribe and continually kept them fighting each other. And so that the imperial power in Rome was always the one who had to come in and arbitrate and make peace between them and decide basically who's going to win. And this is how imperial power is waged. And so the British learned from that and they adopted the Roman style of rule, which is that the last thing in the world you want is peace. You always want people divided and fighting. And when peace breaks out, you have to do something to make sure that war begins again, because war is the health of the empire. War is the means to keep all of the people in the empire fighting each other instead of fighting the emperor. And so this is a very ancient principle. And in the Middle East, as I described, the British gained control of the Middle East through World War One. I think it was probably one of the principal goals of World War One, if not the most important one, was to get control of the Middle East and its oil fields. They did this partly by fomenting the Bolshevik Revolution, having their agent Trotsky sign over control of Persia to the British Empire, then creating through the League of Nations the so-called British Mandate over Palestine and over the very large areas of the rest of the Middle East. And this mandate was ordered by the League of Nations, the very institution which
that they created.
had created
Yeah.
for the purpose of continuing their power in the world, according to Alfred Zimmern in his book, The Third British Empire. So the establishment of a Jewish state was part of this strategy to create a new Middle East that would not be ruled by the Ottoman Empire. It was the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. It had finally outlived its usefulness to Great Britain, and so they had to replace the old power structure with a new one. And what they wanted was to create a Jewish state that would be loyal to Britain because Britain had helped them create it. But they also wanted to create a Muslim power, an Arab power. And at one point, the plan for doing this was to set up, they wanted to set up the equivalent of a Muslim pope who would be seated in Istanbul, in Turkey, in the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And they had a very serious effort for a while of trying to figure out who they could appoint as essentially a pope over the Muslim world, whom all the Muslims would have to listen to. And they eventually abandoned that plan because they discovered that Islam was too divided and into factions, and that it was too decentralized by nature. It wasn't actually designed to have a centralized pope. And so they came up with other plans. But the original plan was to have a Jewish state representing the Western interests, representing essentially the British interests, but the League of Nations, or later the United Nations interests, the interests of, let's say, the civilized West, as they were still calling it in those days. That was the job of the Jewish state, to represent the West. And they wanted the Jews in there for various reasons, but one British source says very plainly, because the Jews would be a super patriotic uh, force, that they would be extremely nationalistic and patriotic and fight very fiercely for their own interests. And for that reason, they would be very suitable to have this role. But at the same time they were doing that, they were also encouraging Arab nationalism. And this, of course, is the whole story of Lawrence of Arabia, which has been mythologized in the movie through him and T.S. Lawrence, or T.E. Lawrence, I'm sorry, and through other British agents and operators. They were mobilizing the Arab nationalists, and they had a particular interest in Turkey. They always wanted Turkey to be the central locus of control over the Arab nationalist movement and the Arab nationalist world. Whether that really worked out for them or not, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on Middle Eastern affairs, and I don't fully understand exactly how the mechanism of control works in the Arab world. But it is noteworthy to me that the Middle Eastern conflict as we have it today was, of course, started by the fact that the British made, first of all, that the British were totally in control of the Middle East at the time that this conflict broke out. They were not only in control of Palestine, as it was called then, but they were in control of all the surrounding areas. And so all of the conflicts, beginning with the riots and so forth, and leading to the various invasions after Israel was declared a state, all of these forces, these paramilitary forces, which eventually became regular military forces, they were all formed in areas within the British Mandate and which were under British colonial control. And so all of these forces were interacted with the British colonial government and received support from them and received promises from them. And I mean, it's now somewhat notorious on social media. There's a lot of people now writing about the contradictory promises that the British made to the Jews and to the Arabs, and that these promises, for obvious reasons, um, were instrumental in starting all the strife in the first place. But beyond just the promises, the very organization of the early paramilitary forces of the different sides were things that happened under British jurisdiction, were under British um, authority, and in circumstances where the British actually had the ability to stop it, similar to the situation in the Russian Civil War, where the British were uniquely in a position to control the outcome and somehow failed to do it. If you, of course, it wasn't really a failure. Just like in the Russian Civil War, the British pretended to fail in the sense of, oh, look, the Bolsheviks won. That's so unfortunate. We wanted to beat them, but we couldn't. It wasn't really a failure. It was, in fact, the outcome the British wanted. I think probably the Middle Eastern situation is similar, where the British were fully in control of the situation, fully in control of all sides in the situation, and pretending that they were trying to keep the peace, and then pretending to leave out of frustration that they couldn't stop these terrible people from fighting each other. But in fact, probably the outcome they got, I would guess, is exactly the situation they wanted, which is a permanent stalemate in which the two sides are permanently fighting without resolution. I think that was the outcome they wanted. And simply because it's, in general, it's the outcome they always want. If you look at how they manage everything, it's always according to this principle: divide and rule, and the balance of power, the principle of what they call balance of power. which in practice means that you keep instigating different countries to keep fighting each other. That's in practice how the balance of power actually works. That you, as the instigator, you, as the central imperial power, um, you get the other powers to fight each other. Whoever is controlling those fights, whoever is instigating those fights, whoever is managing those fights is in charge.
I think that your research and model is basically making a lot of sense of what's happening today in Israel and the war around us. And if you look, for example, at Qatar, Qatar already made some kind of alliance or some protection. They got protection from Britain already in 1868.
Mm.
And Qatar itself is undefensive. They cannot defend themselves. It's a tiny piece of land. It's a desert. And if the British or later on the Americans, who have the biggest base in that area, didn't protect them, I guess Qatar is not going to survive. And Qatar is the number one financier of jihadi in general, and especially Hamas. And it makes sense to me that if your model is correct, then the Americans, who are basically the front of this British Empire in this area, allows them to advance jihadi. And the same, in a way, can be seen in Iran. For example, what happened during the Iran-Iraq war with the Contra things that happened under Reagan. And of course, now, during the 12 Days War, it's absolutely clear that America wanted to save the Ayatollah and stop the war. I can demonstrate it. So if you look at all of that and you assume, like you do, that the British are behind it, do you have any kind of prediction to what might happen here with Israel in the near future? I mean, do you see how it's going to develop?
I really, I really couldn't speculate on that. I mean, we're clearly in the midst of a global crisis, which has been deliberately instigated and engineered for the purpose of creating some transition to some new system. I can only hope that somewhere in this chaos we're experiencing, that there are white hats, that there are good guys. I personally put my trust in President Trump. I'm assuming and hoping that he's a good guy, uh, mainly because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. So I think ultimately in times like these, the only thing we can really do is choose our leader. We have to look around at who are the factions and who are the leaders, and ultimately we have to decide whose lead we're going to follow, because we as ordinary people, there's not really much we can do. And I think this is one of the lessons of this course of research that I'm doing, that all this whole mythology of people's uprisings and people's revolutions, of peasants with pitchforks rising up and bringing down the kings and the aristocrats, it's looking to me more and more as if none of this ever actually happened, as if all of these legendary revolutions were simply manipulations, that they were color revolutions, and that they were fights between different factions, between different elements of the ruling class. So if
Uh,
if this is true, then basically you can't have a revolution, you can't have serious change happen unless it comes from the top. And so it all comes down to deciding what leaders will we follow. And from where I sit, it looks like Trump is that, and that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I'm worried that he's not actually. If I may, actually, you are writing your amazing articles also on the Lew Rockwell, right? What's his name? Remind me.
Sorry.
1 second. Yeah, Lew Rockwell is the head of the Mises Institute. He is a libertarian, and you are writing your articles on his webpage.
Actually, no, not anymore. I did a few years back, and then I moved over to Substack. I've been writing exclusively on Substack now.
I
I
understand.
think many of the articles you cited were among my original articles that I wrote on Lou Rockwell,
Yes, yes. Uh,
and
because I'm a
then
libertarian, so I saw the articles there. I was so amazed by your work, and I actually believe that this is part of the solution. That people actually have to wake up to realize that the belief in authority of government and this mechanism that the elite is always using to divide and conquer and control our lives is never the solution. We have to remove the coercion element from society and to try to call for a voluntary society where no one has enough power to manipulate us against perpetuate war. And I think Liu Rockwell and a lot of those people, philosophers and economists, are doing amazing work. And one more thing that I want to say earlier, you said that no one person can do enough. Look at what you are doing. Your work is incredible. And it's like mind blowing how one person can actually find out and demonstrate so much research and work that can enlighten all of us to understand the situation better. So I salute you for what you're doing. It's absolutely amazing.
well, thank you, and I do just want to appreciate that I of course I stand on the shoulders of giants. I learned about many of these things about the British world system from earlier writers. One I mentioned was Webster Tarpley,
Yeah.
who wrote specifically about that Palmerston network. But yeah, I'm basically just carrying on the work that others did before me, and I like to think it makes a difference. It's very kind of you to say that it does.
It does. It
Does it
definitely does.
really? I don't know. I hope so.
Yeah. Can you please tell us how my audience and the people who are going to watch it are going to find your work and support you?
Well, the best place to find my articles is Substack, and my books are on sale at Amazon.
Yeah. So I would like to mention everyone to pre-order the new book, Who Killed Lincoln, the case against England. I will show the cover one more time. Where is it? This one, right?
Yep.
Yes. That's wonderful. I think I took so much of your kind time. You gave me almost 2 hours and a half, and I'm so happy about it and very appreciative of it. So, with your permission, unless of course you have some last things that you want to say, I think maybe we are going to end the recording. So,
I think we covered all the bases. You're a great interviewer, Harry.
thank you very much. Thank you so much for your hard work. I really appreciate it, and I will make sure to push this information and recording everywhere I can. So I appreciate everything you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.